And this is, brings me to the topic of, the so-called scientific consensus, because that really is a contradiction in terms. If the science is valid, then it's valid. It has nothing to do with there being a consensus of opinion, right? Because it's not valid based on opinion. It's valid based on, if an objective experiment with an independent variable shows it to be true and can't be debunked, then it's true, period. And it doesn't really, the opinions of individual men and women is irrelevant at that point.
And, the truth is what is, and establishing that is the truth is really not the point, because people should care only if it's the truth or not. If you make something as a consensus, people will only look at it as the established truth. So what I'm trying to say is, they don't care if it's the truth, they only care if it's established. If the counter arguments are given against the claims of the positive, then like now, they have become minified. They have been rendered insignificant by the positive.
Not from any errors in dosing or anything, but just from taking as directed. About 140,000 people die from pharmaceutical medications, and that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So these are two non-overlapping studies, and if you combine the data, then what you determine is that it becomes the third leading cause of death. Hello, and welcome to Medicamentum Authentica. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. I'm very excited to have Alexander Raskovic back with me for, I think this is our third interview. And Alexander has a YouTube channel called Realization, and the link will be below in the show notes. And I've just been incredibly impressed with the quality of the information that Alexander has been putting out. In fact, I've been learning myself from him. And we're going to illustrate the depth of his knowledge and commentary today and bring you really an important subject of something happening in the world right now and relate it to the bigger picture, looking at some of the mechanisms and methods that authoritarian regimes around the world use to manipulate and control situations. So the news story that we're going to cover today is about what's going on in the Netherlands with the farming community and new regulations from the globalist climate change authorities. Now, those of you living in the United States may not be aware that while we have been enjoying our relatively free summer, that there is significant strife and turmoil going around in other countries in the world. So places like Sri Lanka have been completely devastated. We also see issues in many European countries, including Italy. But the Netherlands has been kind of a ground zero for some of what's been going on, and it will do a good job of illustrating what is likely going to be coming to the United States already, because it's a continuation, essentially, of the terms of the Paris Accord. So if you have been seeing some of those videos where farmers are talking about the government ordering them to destroy their crops instead of sending them to market, this has come about because of President Biden re-signing the United States on to the Paris Accord, which is, a international treaty, essentially, that binds us to adopt these policies to address, quote unquote, climate change. And that's why, in order to lower the standards of use of carbon emissions and fossil fuels on farms from the farming equipment, they have asked a lot of farmers to essentially destroy their crops in order to decrease those emissions and be in compliance with the agreement. And there's something even more egregious happening across the Atlantic. So welcome back to this discussion, Alexander.
Andy, thank you so much. It is an honor once again to be on Medicamentum Authentica. And it is such a great opportunity to speak about such a very pertinent topic as the Dutch farmer situation here in the Netherlands. I live in the Netherlands in South Holland, and I have been having a first glance experience of what has been going on here. And to illustrate on the situation that is basically going around all over the world, that you can basically boil down to a deprivation of everything that we've all known, and everything that we've known and held as held for value. We can actually, in the Netherlands, we can say what happens here might happen all over the world at some point. So maybe if I can start right at the point of how this Dutch farmer situation actually came about, what the origins of it was, you come to the very first thing, and that is media promulgations, false assumptions and denigrations that come from mainstream or vested media. And when it comes to Dutch farmers here are denigrated, and they were being oppressed for a very long time here in the Netherlands. We're talking before 2019. In 2019, basically the demonstrations and the protests of Dutch farmers coming together and showing strength, there was a prelude for that to occur. And that's basically the mainstream media or the vested media always promulgating and the notion that Dutch farmers aren't competent. They are very, how do I say, they don't pay attention to much. They're very slow-witted, and they have been the cause of many worldly problems in the Netherlands, and a lot of things that have been said about them to place them under the thumb, basically.
So, Alexander, are you saying that this, because, I think some people might realize that there was recently a new government regulation that led to the current scale of the protests, but are you saying that this essentially that the Dutch farmers were singled out by the media even before the Plandemic began? So if that's the case, then I just want to, alert the listeners to the kind of the history, because, the Netherlands made it a priority to produce their own food supply. And in fact, they're one of the largest producers for Europe at large. So they're a big exporter of food right around the European nations. And they are actually known as being some of the most productive and most efficient farmers in the world, because they've really honed their technique. And I believe they might even be the largest supplier of meat to Europe. So this is, completely contradicts the media narrative that you were just saying, criticizing them as lazy or ignorant or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, many people, farmers, they are very hard workers. And, to get to the heart of it, really, if we just, before 2019, there was this situation that was going around about nitrogen and ammonia. Well, before this, this issue was going on before the Plandemic, as you've mentioned, where there were basically a few, all the Dutch farmers, all the firms of farmers around the Netherlands were being attacked with this nitrogen card, as we describe it. So there were also these smaller firms, this handful of less significant firms in the context of nitrogen emissions, if you believe the narrative, where they basically said, you guys don't pose that much of a nitrogen threat, so we will bestow upon you a license. And this license was called a pasmelding, or een programmatische aanpak stikstof. In English, this would be a programmatic approach to nitrogen. And this is basically grants them a sort of exemption, in the sense that you don't pose that much of a nitrogen threat, so we won't attack you as much. That was the idea. Well, there was this case in 2019, and the 29th of May in 2019, there's a large court case. After this case, the so-called license was revoked and was essentially rendered insignificant for these 3,000 smaller firms. So the result of it was that all the 3,000 firms were deemed illegal afterwards. And because of it, and because this was obviously such a brutal way to treat someone, there wasn't much rigorous action taken against these firms up until recently, where 3 firms in Overijssel had to close down. And the cattle to the slaughter bin, failure to comply will result in a fine. And without using any euphemisms, this would constitute an extortion of 10,000 euros a day, or we will come and do violence unto you.
So Alexander, if we could just back up for a minute here, because I'm a little bit confused.
Sure.
So tell me, what are you talking about with nitrogen cards? What is the issue that you mean by nitrogen, and where did this come from?
So basically, the Dutch farmers are being placed under such a they're being claimed to be the culprits of nitrogen emission, which serves kind of the agenda of the United Nations of trying to reduce climate, trying to.
Okay, so I knew that's where you were going, but how, we mostly hear about CO2 and we hear about methane gas, but what is the nitrogen issue? I mean, we know that petroleum-based fertilizers, right, which are used to grow plants, are nitrogen-based. But here we're talking about ranchers, right? And when you say a firm, you're talking about a ranch, right? Like an operation that raises livestock for meat, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so you're saying the smaller ranchers, as opposed to the big firms, have been singled out. But what is this nitrogen issue specifically? How does it relate to the animals and the ranchers?
Well, it is said that the cattle, or the fay, as we call it here, they produce, let's say, ammonia by means of fecal excretion. And this gas, if you will, this chemical reaction, if you will, they blame it to be the cause of various climate issues. And that is basically one of the reasons why they say they attack Dutch farmers here, especially together with nitrogen, when they actually never address the point that nitrogen and ammonia aren't directly related. But where this nitrogen story comes from is actually, it reveals kind of the flaws of it as well. Because to all of the other firms who, quote, have a license, they threaten with this nitrogen card, and which is still to this day a very obscure topic, as it would come off as I explain it, because it is a very obscure topic. There isn't much.
Right. So, Alexander, are they saying, or are they talking about molecular nitrogen, like N2, that is a greenhouse gas, or what's
nitrogen oxide? That's
nitrogen oxide.
Exactly.
Okay. And do cows have nitrogen oxide emissions, or they have no, that's because ammonia, right, is essentially any animal that eats protein. The end product of protein metabolism is ammonia, right? And that's comes out in the urine, right? Yeah. Or it gets transformed to urea in the body and comes out as urea in the urine, right? But our urine produces the nitrogen products, waste products, right? And the same thing would be with farm animals, of course. So is that what you're talking about, that somehow is equated with nitrogen oxide, which is a greenhouse gas?
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's N2O, right? Nitrogen oxide?
Yeah. So, well, the obscure thing about it actually is these sorts of estimations about nitrogen It all comes forward from a program that is based on computer models that gives an estimation of the aggregate nitrogen emissions. And this comes forth from a research institute of the government here, which is the RIVM. And the obvious flaw in its practice is obviously because even if you believe the whole nitrogen story as the culprit of various climate issues, it is based on nationwide aggregate nitrogen emissions, and it is not aimed at specific firms. So the discrepancy in the percentage to which a firm has to reduce inevitably differs locally at this place. Like at this place, it's 49%. At this place, it's 51%. It's very relative.
So it's very arbitrary, just like, in New York, you're supposed to wear a mask, but in Georgia, you don't have to, even though the situation is the same in both places. So if I could summarize, so essentially we have a situation here where the government of Holland has adopted essentially a global policy, perhaps part of an agreement like the Paris Accord or following the United Nations Agenda 21 guidelines or other international bodies. And they have instituted a limitation on quote unquote nitrogen emissions from livestock. And what this means on the ground for ranchers is, aside from whether there's anything really scientific here that's harmful, which it doesn't seem like there is, the ranchers are essentially required to reduce the number of livestock, so the size of their herds, in order to limit this nitrogen emission. However, the situation is they are essentially, if the ranchers did this, they would have to go out of business.
Yeah.
And if they don't do it, they're going to be fined exorbitant amounts of money, and perhaps even their ranch property is going to be seized at some point through a violent confrontation. Is that about what you're saying?
That is correct. Yes.
So how are, and this is what really is what makes this, sort of newsworthy from a general news station perspective, is that how the farmers have been responding to this, the ranchers. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, after this case in 2019, where this license was basically like, oops, sorry, we made a mistake. And now this license is revoked. It's not worth anything anymore. And now these smaller firms were deemed as illegal. And you're actually, to treat something like that in such an immoral fashion, which leads to immoral behavior, it's just not something that Dutch farmers here are going to, they're not going to
stand for.
Yeah, exactly. So what they do is they came together, all of them, in not that very, some of them through organizations like the Dutch Farmers for Defense, and some of them just came together locally through individual communication. And they decided to take on their vehicles and come together and show and present awareness to the entire nation that something is happening beyond the nation's comprehension, so to speak. So they right now this is still going on, and as per usual, the mainstream media tries to place it under the thumb as something that is a violent effort made by these farmers. Like here in the Netherlands, we have this, the hourly news, which always tries to convey this notion that the farmers are violent. So they're violent people. They're going against the norms that we've established, and they're trying to form this opinion. They're trying to build this worldview towards these farmers as a way to separate people from the farmers, separate the Dutch people from an understanding of the farmers. But luckily this hasn't had much success because of, lots of activities are happening. We have like a sign that is like the Dutch flag upside down, which basically represents blauw, wit, rood, Nederland in nood. That in English that would say blue, white, red. And red would be perpendicular to note, as in alert, be alert, the Netherlands, something is happening here, something is going on. But that's just the principle of the flag turned upside down. But the news is already using the guilt by association fallacy by not ascribing that meaning to it, but ascribing a situation to it, as by saying, "Oh, we used that flag in the Second World War as well." So right. Look, these are very, very these are people with very low P's and Q's, so to speak. And from there, basically, they end. Hypothetically, they end every hourly news speech they do with, "Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Dutch hourly news, and you have been lied to." Wait, well, who put that on the teleprompter? And that's all it is, and people are actually becoming aware of it, but not to the extent that we actually want to see it.
Right. So what, we might have been seeing, if you've seen any coverage or film footage of this, is that these ranchers actually, you said took their vehicles, but they actually took their farm tractors, yeah, right, and all converged on the urban centers, right, in a display of solidarity. And of course, they've been, accused of being a threat to safety, I'm sure, to democracy, things like that. And we just recently had a presidential address in the United States from Biden, giving what was staged as a wartime address, because he had two Marines behind him, and there were these blood red lights that were just like a scene from the movie V for Vendetta, where you have a dictator giving an address to the public. And in the speech, he basically said, that it wasn't the farmers in this case. It was the supporters of former President Trump, but which is, close to half of our country, and if not more, and basically said that all of those people are a threat to democracy, and essentially called them, terrorists or revolutionaries, creating, a stage for public outrage, and that it would be justified to perform violence against that group. And it seems like we have an analogous situation in the Netherlands, with the farmers descending upon the cities to show solidarity and say, we're not going to, stand up for this. We're going to stick together. We're not going to let, 30% of us go out of business and have their land taken and be victims of violence, right? We're going to stick together and stand up to the government. And then you have the media, and I'm sure the government also, trying to say that they are inciting violence, right? They're the cause of the problem. They don't care about the environment and things like that, which is couldn't be further from the truth, right? And then I think I shared this with you just before the interview. I'm not sure if you saw it, but a headline from The Guardian, right, that in the Dutch city of Haarlem, that's with two A's, not like New York, they have made it against the law to have any advertisements for meat as food. So in other words, they can't have an advertisement for beef or pork or lamb or chicken anywhere on their TV, in billboards, in public. Right. And you can see that this is where this is headed. So first, let's put ranchers out of business and take their land. Let's ban advertising meat as food. And then in the future, let's actually make it illegal to eat meat.
Yeah.
Right. Do you see things headed in that direction?
Well, they do it very gradually, is what I have seen throughout my experience as looking at the situation pragmatically. This is also always done very incrementally and very gradually, by kind of trying to ensconce people in this very direction that they want the world eventually to get to. And as I've seen the progression over the years, I've seen many people, getting used to, especially after the Plandemic, from getting used to working from home and not really wanting things to be in the latter case, but Well, the directions, as in the context of what you're saying, with the food supply and all of that being denigrated, so to speak, I do see you do hear a lot about that in the hourly news here in the Netherlands. About the advertisements, I haven't really seen that much of it here in the Netherlands. As far as, well, I don't really pay attention to vested papers, and so my credibility in that I wouldn't really consider. But as far as I've seen, well, there is indeed that the presence of that denigration of various food products.
Do you have any sense of what the overall agenda is behind the government's actions to close down ranchers?
Especially here in the Netherlands, well, there have been speculations about, well, the Netherlands has a very, very strong culture. And it is also very, it has to do with the lands that we have. But over the decades, the Netherlands has become much more, how do I say, like more closer together. People don't enjoy the space that actually, yeah, how do I say, the space that is essential for living a peaceful life. Well, people are very encroached, or how do I say, like people are living very closely together, and that's right. Getting even
like sardines.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really, and essentially there have been speculations that the farmlands are going to be made into more cities, and the Netherlands is basically going to turn into a wider city where people are going to be more likely going to be subjects to government decrees at some point, because, you know, there's no touch with that natural feel that one would actually intrinsically desire. But right. If I would just take it a little further in the sense of thinking holistically and taking it a few steps back of what, you know, is speculated as per usual, I see a lot of inversions in things that are happening in a common sense perspective. I mean, you know, to deviate from nitrogen, we also have the carbon dioxide issue that has been used as a means to justify many immoral behaviors from governments. And not that I'm a supporter of government, as we'll come to at some point, perhaps eventually, but these attempts to denigrate the sun as a cause of destruction. The sun has been accused of things like climate change and skin cancer. Now, how can something that has sustained life for millennia become detrimental to life in a matter of years? CO2 obviously is not the culprit here, since it is the oxygen of plants, which we eat. Without
right. So this, Alexander, I think, you know, this is when I first went through my own waking up process of realizing that, you know, all these things were told by the government and the media and the educational institutions are not really the truth. The first subject I tackled was this climate issue, because I was very passionate about this. Like, I was a climate activist, and I think, you know, we would all agree that we want to treat the earth really well. We want to keep it in good shape. Exactly. We don't want to pollute it and poison it and kill it, right? Of course not. In fact, I mean, I love being in nature more than anywhere else. So I came from that, but I thought the problem was this warming issue, right, with CO2. And then I started looking into it. And of course, it was the same thing that I discovered about germ theory and viruses, that what we're told is the scientific conclusion. There's actually no scientific evidence behind. But in the end, once I really got a grasp of the situation and the, you know, how the carbon cycle works, you know, on the planet and things like this, I realized what you're saying, that carbon dioxide is plant food. It's actually the carbon source, the food source of the plant, right? We don't think about a gas as food, right? And people, even with biology degrees, if you ask them what do plants eat, right? They'll say, it eats from the soil or something like that. They not even realize what food is. But the CO2 is plant food, right? So if you have more CO2, what happens? Plants grow bigger, right? It doesn't result in more CO2 in the atmosphere. The reason we get more CO2 in the atmosphere is when the atmosphere is warmer for whatever reason that makes it warmer, then CO2 is less soluble in water. And so the dissolved CO2 in the ocean comes back into the air. And this is one of the historically before industry, this was the only way you'd have increased CO2 in the atmosphere, because any increased CO2 in the atmosphere just makes plants grow bigger. In fact, in commercial greenhouses, where they're trying to maximize their yield at a price, because, to heat a greenhouse and build and maintain the structure is expensive. So that tomato that you're growing in the hothouse is going to be way more expensive to produce than a tomato, out in the summer sun. And to increase their yield, what do? They actually pump in CO2 to the inside of the hothouse to make it higher concentration in the air, because they're basically giving more food to the plants so they grow faster and bear more fruit, right? So this is the inversion. We're told CO2 is the end of the earth, when really it's the plant food that makes the earth healthier. And in fact, if the ambient CO2 in the air falls below a critical level, which right now it's relatively close to, then you have forests contracting and plants dying because there's not enough food. It's essentially a drought for plants. And so if we adopt some kind of technology that sequesters CO2 out of the air, for example, which is what plants do in nature and the oceans do, then we're essentially going to starve our forests on this planet, right? And this is the inversion, is that CO2 is actually one of the most key things to keep our planet healthy, but in the inversion, it's said that it's the thing that's going to end up killing us all.
Exactly. And without it, all plant life, as you've said, would perish. And the same goes for our lives, because plants turn the CO2 we breathe out into O2 we breathe in. Plants need CO2 and we need O2.
That's right. And you can't be a carnivore if all the plants are dead either, because all the meat animals that you would eat wouldn't have any food. So it would be a mass extinction of every species on the planet. Exactly.
And yeah, this is what we provide for each other while we breathe together. This symbiotic relation with our environment has sustained life, and the same goes for the sun. Such contradictions aren't regular in nature, but they are regular in things that are man-made, like sunscreen, which literally contains carcinogens.
Absolutely. I spent some time, and I never reported on this because I believe I did this before I even did any public speaking in this platform, but I've looked at all the data on skin cancer and sunscreen and such, and it's pretty clear that the sunscreen actually is what causes the malignant melanoma. And by the way, another area where there's this inversion in medicine is with, esophageal reflux or chronic heartburn, that it's said that irritates the esophagus, causes Barrett's esophagus, which then turns into esophageal cancer. And that if you take these proton pump inhibitors, right, which are drugs like Prilosec, Nexium, and things like that, the PPIs, that it will reverse that condition because it decreases your acid production and then it reverses your reflux. But actually, if you look at the data, and there's even mainstream scientists in medicine who have admitted this, that it's actually these drugs that have brought about the increase in esophageal cancer, and it's not the reflux condition at all. It's the drugs that they're said to prevent the cancer, but they actually cause it. Another big inversion.
Yeah, exactly. The same way other things that are good for us are also denigrated as something that is bad for you, like cholesterol, which is a requisite a vitamin D intake that the sun provides yet again. Yet cholesterol is also being denigrated with harmful substances like statin drugs. And you can go on, like bacteria, for instance. Many people, when they get introduced to your work and my work, that, well, they think of viruses being the only exception to not being able to cause disease, because they, in fact, are not actually, if you look
in existence.
Exactly. But bacteria, the very purpose of bacteria is that they are very efficient at biodegrading dead material, because that's their role. They are saprotrophic, meaning they break down dead organic material and they release the nutrients into the environment, which are then consumed by other organisms. Another symbiotic relation, again, with their environment is what makes them so essential for life. And they also do this in a vast amounts of other environments, like the roots of plants, where they fix nitrogen and convert it into the proper form for the plant to be able to absorb in order to sustain the life of the plant. And they do the same with us, like bacteria live in the digestive system of animals and humans, where they process food we eat and release the vital nutrients for the absorption by the body, which is known as the intestinal flora, i.e. they are not detrimental, they are vital for life. Yet they are being denigrated as germs that need to be destroyed with even more harmful antibiotics. And so you can see the blatant inversions everywhere, how the things that are actually good for you and have a purpose in your life are surreptitiously being sold as something that is the exact opposite, as something that is detrimental.
You know, Alexander, it's like you can't say two sentences without mentioning another inversion, because, they're so prominent. Like the antibiotic, that's another one, right? It's told to you that this is a life-saving medication, but look at just what the word means. Against biotic life. It's against life, yet you're told it's life-saving, right?
Exactly.
The complete opposite of what it is. So this is a really for discernment, right? In other words, the skill of using your judgment to tell if a source of information is truthful or reliable or not. Looking for inversions of meaning is a big clue, because if you find inversions, and that means that the source of information is using the inverted meaning, not the real meaning, then that is a dead giveaway that that source is not trustworthy. Right now, it doesn't mean every piece of information from that source is not trustworthy, because as Alexander has taught us in a separate material, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But you have to then be doubly as skeptical of all the information from that source once you see inversions. So this is a really useful strategy to look at. And even the word germ, as I've brought up many times, is an inversion of meaning, because the roots of that word mean a new life, or new growth. And, traditionally we say germ cells, right? That's the egg and the sperm. They make the new organism, the new life. And then when Rockefeller medicine came in and the germ theory, they inverted the meaning to say an invasive enemy microorganism that will kill you, right? The exact opposite.
Exactly. And that's what this system does. It takes everything that is of true importance to us and it turns it into something destructive or trivial. And, when we actually get to the core of it, the actual elephant in the room, when we actually get back to the Dutch farmer situation, this actually is one of the very tenets of overt communism. Government control over agriculture being centrally dictated by an overarching self-proclaimed authority figure. In quotes, because they're not authority figures, nothing of the kind. And this is really the pink elephant in the room when it comes to controversial topics like this, I would say. It is just a concept that is enacted by people who believe in it. This whole idea of authority over others. And because it is solely dependent on belief, they have to use violence in order to subvert the will of the many and get them to defer to the judgment of the will of the few. And that's kind of all authority, all that government is. It is an illusion, and a violent illusion at that. And frankly, that's all government ever adds to the mix. It doesn't propose voluntary integration based on mutual cooperation and rapport. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called a government, and it wouldn't have a half-witted army of blindly obedient henchmen to enforce their dogmatic decrees upon people. And of course, almost everyone had been convinced in their lives that governments can be good if you just watch out for corruption and put the right people in those positions. And no, it cannot be good. Corruption is merely a symptom of something that people don't really want to be confronted with, I would say. Because all government does is it threatens people with violence, which people laughingly call the law. The law with a lowercase l. We're not talking about higher law, intrinsic law.
Right. We're really talking about the legal system.
Exactly,
right?
Man's law, if you will.
Right, like statutes, ordinances, and things like that.
Exactly.
Not natural law, not the real law, not God's law.
No, exactly. And people are being fed all the propaganda that it is more significant than that, because of all the terms used. You mentioned 1984 at one point, and that's actually what George Orwell once mentioned. If you use the correct semantics and use the words that people associate, like nature and love and freedom and space, all of those things, if you use those words, people have a direct association with something good. But because you use things like we are freedom, we represent freedom, we represent security, and if you actually pragmatically look at what they're doing and what the purpose of authority actually is, it deviates from it again. It's an inversion of what they say they actually represent. And everybody knows that when an authority issues a law, you have to do this or you're not allowed to do this. And if you disobey, we hurt you, which is their foundation, right. Coercion and violence. Just consider the foundation of why people think government is a requisite of peaceful civilization. And you're going to laugh at this because it's just so blatantly obvious. People openly describe that the reason government is needed is because people are malicious, negligent, nasty, and cannot be trusted. And because human beings are so careless, stupid, malicious that they cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own, the situation actually be improved by taking a subset of those very same careless, stupid, and malicious individuals and giving them societal permission to forcibly control all the others and give them the right to do harm unto those who disobey them. Now, why would anyone logically and rationally think that rearranging and reorganizing a group of dangerous beasts would make the others, quote, civilized?
Right. Well, Alexander, I'm sure that nobody in their rational mind thinks that. But what I think the reason people might give lip service to that, even though deep down, they don't really believe it, is because they don't want the responsibility to have to deal with all of these situations themselves. Like, for example, let's just take a simple practical thing that affects people every year where I live in central New York, which is that there's a lot of snowfall, right? So not everybody is capable of shoveling or, they don't have their own snowplow or machine to take care of all the snow removal from everywhere, right? So maybe they can do it on their private property where they just have a little walkway and a little driveway. But, if they had to do their whole street, right? Or do the street in front of their neighbors, right? Everybody would be stuck at home and not be able to drive and get groceries and go to school and go to work and things like that. So we need, some way to deal with this. Now, we could self-organize and say, okay, like on our block, who's got a pickup truck? Let's all chip in, buy them a plow, give them some money, so that they can plow the street whenever it snows, if they agree. Or we can all chip in and, pay a company to come and clear our street for us, right? And so these things, like, they all are very achievable. You can have really high quality services. It's much more efficient if you're dealing directly with the company, right, as the consumer and all of that. So it'd be more affordable. But it requires everybody to say, all right, we've got to be responsible for ourselves. We've got to organize this. We've got to make it happen, right? And that is like just a big burden that people don't want. And so they just happy, oh yeah, I'll just let the government take care of it, like, and then every time, like, oh, and then they realize that they're not getting the best services, right? And then they're like, and they can't tell how much it costs because they just get this tax bill for their property tax, and it's not itemized. It doesn't say what the money's used for. It's in there somewhere, but you're like, gosh, are they doing it efficiently or not? Are they charging me $100 every time they plow in front of my street? I don't even know. There's no way to know, right? But I don't think about it. Like, I just know that most of the time when it snows, at least within a day or two, maybe 3, the street will be plowed. Right? And they're like, all right, that's good enough, because I have to spend, 40, 50, 60 hours at my slave wage job. And then as soon as I come home, I've got to like make dinner and lunch for my kids. And then if I'm lucky, I get 2 hours to veg out in front of the TV and suck down a bottle of wine before I have to do it all over again. And this is the sorry cultural conditioning and manipulation that led us to this current situation, where now it's at the point where if the government went away, we wouldn't even know how to do anything for ourselves. Exactly. We would have to like start at square one, like, step one, what is this? How do I get from this to what I need to be achieved? And, this makes us all dependent, so that in a situation of crisis, like we faced the last 2 years, nobody knows how to take care of themselves in that situation. And I think actually what's happened in the last 2 years is that there's a strong minority of men and women who have realized this about themselves and say, gosh, it's time for me to start learning some things. And I may not be able to rely on the system forever. Right? I need to learn how to produce my own food. I need to learn how to build my own house. I need to learn how to, harness enough energy to meet my needs. I need to sew my own clothes. I need to, repair my own furniture, repair my own car, all of these kind of things. And this is where we need to be completely independent and not have to be manipulated by these centralized authority systems and institutions. But we need to also reestablish communities so that we can pool resources. Like for myself, right now I'm very lucky that I can make a living by putting out educational material, selling some nutritional products, providing, consultation services over e-commerce, like through the internet, to a worldwide audience of people that, are interested in what we're talking about. But I realize that these centralized authoritarian governments may take away those abilities from me. Right. And what do I have something to offer to my community? Because my community may not want to sit through lectures and learn about things. But what do they need? They have health situations, and they need someone to help them figure out how to deal with health situations. Right. Their baby's sick. Their parents are dying. Right. They have a trauma. They get in a car accident. They break a bone. And so I realize that I have this skill and this knowledge, right? I know any health issue, barring reattaching a severed finger, I have the knowledge and ability to handle it if it happens to me or my family, right? And I know I'm a little bit unique in that respect, but I can be that person for my community, that if anyone in my community needs that kind of service, that'll be my role. Right. And I won't be the guy plowing the street, because because I'll be the health medical person, but there'll be someone else who has a truck with a plow, and they maybe and they have a lot of energy, and they don't need much sleep, right? And that would be their skill to the community. But I still am capable of running the plow. Like, I know how to run a plow, I know how to run a snowblower, I know how to do carpentry, right? And so I don't always need to rely on someone, but in a community, I can take care of the carpenter's kids, and the carpenter can repair, my trim in my dining room or whatever. Yeah. So this is how we can, because in order to get away from this control system, we have to be much more independent and resilient. And, because like you said earlier on, that these changes happen so incrementally, right? They're like in slow motion, so that by the time we realize what these changes, where they're heading, it's too late to go back. And it's the same now. Like, we're way beyond the stage of sitting around and saying, hey, it's a pain to organize the snowplows, let's just let the government take care of it. Now we're like, we don't know how to do anything for ourselves. The government is, like our mommy, and it takes care of us. And we have to become our own parents first. Then we can separate, and then we can truly be free, away from this control and tyranny. And now is the time that we must make this transition, because the tyranny and the control system is rapidly amping up their levels of control. And there will be a point, mostly due to technology, that it will be too late to turn the whole system back. Now, we still may be able to live outside of that system, but it'll be much more difficult. So whereas there is an opportunity here for all of humanity to turn this situation around and become, decentralized, like we can have central agreements of principles. Like in the United States, for example, the Constitution, not in its entirety, but almost all of it, and especially if you add the Declaration of Independence, like, you have a really strong set of principles that without a central authority figure, all the decentralized places, like my community over here, the other community in this state and that state, we can all agree, for example, that we're all going to follow these principles. Like, we're not going to infringe upon the rights of others. We all agree to that. There's not going to be any FBI enforcing it or any police authority. We're going to enforce it ourselves or in our local communities, but we're going to all agree to live by those principles. And then when we cooperate to do commerce together, to cross-populate or pollinate or, do anything with other people, or have our people travel to your place and your people travel to our place, we're going to stick to those guiding principles. And, that's a way that you can organize a society without any centralized authority, but with consistency. Like, basically what we're saying is we're all agree to follow natural law, really, or at least, certain integral and primary parts of it. And that can be a framework that we can all hold ourselves accountable to. So there's the alternative to central authority is not chaos, but it is self-accountability and self-responsibility. And that's really what I promote in my healing education. And I think you'll agree that this is a requisite to change this system into one that is more the way that we want to return to living.
Exactly, as you've aptly explained. And not only do people look to government to protect us from the imperfections of humanity, what they don't get is that the only thing that they're actually adding and happens as a result of the state is more of the latter things we just mentioned. Like more of the things that we don't want, like more stealing, more murder, more trespass, more harm, and that's all that the state ever does. It doesn't come along and makes nice, helpful suggestions like, I can offer doing the services for you for this exchange of value, and it doesn't do that. It doesn't make suggestions for you to consider by means of your own judgment, if you will. It makes commands, and it hurts those who disobey.
That's
And you
right.
cannot extinguish a fire with more fire. So the idea that you can make a civilization by way of doing the very things that are the exact opposite to civilization is insanity. But it is what we are all taught by means of indoctrination and excessive repetition of an erroneous idea that is statism in its entirety, and the concept of authority over people's lives and property. So all forms of government can basically be placed in one definition, and that is statism. The brilliant idea that we give a small group of people the right to kidnap, imprison, harass, steal from and kill people so that we can be protected from people who kidnap, harass, steal from, and kill people. What would normally be considered as crimes are committed in proxy by authority, which constitutes moral relativism. And that's the idea that morality can differ according to time, preference, or location, or individual whims. And that's also something we have to abandon, as you've said, and come to an actual rapport, come to actual agreement with each other by means of voluntary interaction. And we have to understand that a wrong cannot magically become a right by changing the words around. Instead of saying stealing, you circumlocutorally call it confiscation or taxation.
Right.
It is signed into a piece of paper called a legislation. However, theft is still being committed, and something is still being taken without permission, which you wouldn't be able to do as a regular individual, but are perfectly able to do as a government. So there is a discrepancy in terms of rights. But we still, in our cognitive dissonance, most of us, consider us, every human being, as having the same rights. Yet these entities called governments have the right to do the harmful things that we wouldn't normally be able to do. I would highly recommend a remarkable video of Larkin Rose. I don't know if you know him, but he made a video called I'm Allowed to Rob You, and he basically brings people back to reality by demonstrating the illegitimacy of making a wrong into a right because of the clever use of names and because it is signed into a piece of paper. And, you can't delegate a right you don't have.
Absolutely. And I would also mention that people might want to check out Derek Brose, because he has a book on agorism, which is like the economic system that could develop without a centralized authority. And it's compatible with a sort of anarchical libertarian type of decentralized system, which, I don't want to get into all the different labels and things because they all have inversions of meaning as well. Exactly. But let's just say a free system without this tyranny. So, Alexander, you have really helped crystallize the issues and presented this fascinating and very troubling case study on the Dutch farmers to illustrate how authority uses inversion and other tactics of manipulation and propaganda to essentially enforce their ability to control and perpetrate violence and tyranny upon us. And then, of course, we talked about the ways that we can get out of this system and prevent this from reaching its ultimate goal in the end. So once again, thank you so much for enriching us with this knowledge and information. And Alexander, would you tell us about any projects coming up or where the viewers can find out more about your work?
Sure. People can visit my website, which is realization.com. And people can find my library of the material that I've produced about germ theory. I've produced material about epistemology and the trivium. And people can type in the same name and find it on YouTube, realization, as in real and genuine eyeballs and Asian.
And we'll have a link below so you can click directly. But Alexander, didn't you tell me that there is a documentary project that you are nearing completion upon? You want to let people know what's coming?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, I am working on to wrap up the kind of discussion about germ theory is really to address, well, I've substantiated how viruses, the claim that viruses are the culprits of diseases, are the causes of diseases, is disprovable. The same goes for bacteria. But then you're left with all of the remaining questions that people have about, well, what is the cause of this disease and of polio and of AIDS? Well, I am going through all of the prominent diseases that are known for the majority by people, and to explain to people how these diseases have causes that other than supposed germs, so that, as you've eloquently explained, they're not actually the usage of the germ. The word germ is not proper in that sense. But well, it's kind of to give the viewer the kind of the ability to apply the principle of Occam's razor and remember what cause was ascribed to polio, and then I explain the real cause of polio, and you can choose whichever one is more rational to you. And as soon as I've presented all of the evidence and substantiated the significance over any germ or bacteria or virus, people will come to realize how the germ theory doesn't have any feet to stand on, which essentially brings back an importance of a solid foundation of epistemology, as we've described in the previous video.
Well, I can't wait to see that. I'm sure the same is true of my audience, and I really want to compare it to my research on polio and the other illnesses that you'll be covering. So I'm very excited about that. So everyone, don't forget to look for this upcoming work from Alexander, and please make sure that you are on my email newsletter subscription list, which you can find at andrewkaufmanmd.com. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
This is all about fear. And if people were not afraid, you would see this disappear literally overnight.
There is no existence of a virus, and unfortunately you need a child to be able to point to the emperor and say he's got no clothes on.
Once we can understand that it's a model that is bankrupt, that's built on fraud and misinterpretation, then we can liberate ourselves from it and move towards something much more truthful.